everyone. So I'm Sasha Kravchenko from Michigan State University, and we'll talk about soil carbon cycle. Let's start with big picture, where carbon is globally. Some of the big players is atmosphere with, let's see, do I do that? Where it is as carbon dioxide, vegetation, where it is as an organic material, fossil organic carbon, something that we are heavily using. Ocean is a big player in global carbon cycle. And last that I want to mention, but definitely not least for us, is soils. Overall, soils store more carbon in them, or have more carbon in them, than both atmosphere and all global vegetation together. And it's likely to have more of it before we humans started to plow, because plowing depleted soil of a lot of its carbon. And what can we potentially do by judicious management is hopefully return some of that carbon from the atmosphere back into soil. And that, of course, is one of the objectives of our project. So how can you tell whether your soil has a lot or not so much carbon? It's very easy. You can tell by color. What you see here on the left is soil with a lot of carbon, dark is good, and on the right is soil with very little of it. So now, armed with that piece of information, you can judge for yourself, looking at these three soil profiles, how much carbon they have. In soil, carbon is mostly, or what we are mostly interested in here, is as soil organic matter. And again, what you see here are three soil profiles. On the left is mollisol, a very rich, as you can see, carbon-rich soil are formed under grasslands, and this is what you guys enjoy in Iowa and Illinois, those rich productive soils with as much as 5 to 15% of soil organic matter in them. In the middle is an example of an alphisol, what we have in Michigan, soil formed under forests, and as you can see, as you can see by color of it, most of its carbon is in the top 10 to 20 centimeters. And on the right is an example of a profile from an arid desert with hardly any soil organic matter, hardly any carbon in there. So if we look at a global picture, deserts and mountains have hardly any carbon or hardly any soils to speak of. Plains, forests, tropical forests have more. Those are greens. And the largest amount of carbon in soils are in the northern parts of the globe, in those peat-originated forests and permafrost-based soils. Well, thinking of soil organic matter, we should not forget that it is not just a repository for that potential CO2 and reducing climate change effects, but it's actually the key component of soil quality and key component of soil productivity, and that's something that we are going to or are looking at in our project. Soil organic matter is the main source of plant nutrients. It is the main driving factor influencing what would be the soil, air, and water regime for plants to grow in. It is related to or affecting, interrelated with a number of soil properties. Many of those we also are studying here. And it is, as well, a major source of energy for soil microorganisms. So let's look at that soil carbon cycle in a little bit more detail. It all begins with plants. They, by process of photosynthesis, take CO2 from the atmosphere and build from it their bodies. They build those complex organic micromolecules. Some of the CO2 is lost in the process and goes back to atmosphere as plant respiration. Then what happens with the rest is, just as plant keeps growing, some of that produced organic material goes into the soil as plant root exudates. And as plants die, that organic material goes back to soil as shoot and root residues. What happens with that material in the soil, it becomes decomposed, some by soil fauna and most of it by myriads of microbes living in the soil. Again, in the process of decomposition, a substantial amount will be going back to atmosphere as CO2 in that soil respiration process, something that, as Mike described, we are measuring as part of this project. And while some amounts will be leached as dissolved organic carbon out of the soil profile, what I don't have here is some of it might be lost by erosion. And what will be left in the soil and what we are most interested in is that soil organic matter. So what we want is we want to increase the amount of the soil organic matter. And there are, I guess we can approach that from two ends. One, we can increase the inputs. So it's how much inputs those plants contribute to the soil. It's not just the total amounts, it's also seasonal duration of those inputs. It is diversity and quality of those inputs that matter as well. For example, those root exudates, something that plants contribute to soil while they are alive, can be as much as 70% of their overall productivity, and studies have shown that root exudates-derived carbon is retained by soil more effectively than what's added by shoots and roots. What you see here on the right is a figure based on Paul Veronese group work from Canada, and it's a nice example of a very close relationship between the amount of carbon added to soil and the inputs. So increasing the input is a way, and two of the practices that we are looking at in this project, extended rotation and cover crops, is they do exactly that. So the other end of that picture is reduced decomposition. That would be another way of increasing that soil organic matter. Let's look at some numbers. If overall, we'll say plants produce 10 tons of carbon per hectare per year, then about 3 tons of it will be added to soil, and majority, 4/5 of it, will be decomposed right away. Some, again, by fauna, and the lion's share by microorganisms, bacteria and fungi. And then about this 0.6 of a ton will remain in soil as that organic matter. So let's look at organic matter in more detail and what the complexity of that, of that task is. That soil organic matter consists of a very large number of variety of organic compounds, anywhere from simple ones like glucose, for example, to very complex ones. And some of them, or most of them, cannot be really purely extracted and studied as is. So what is typically done is we look at soil organic carbon in terms of how quickly it can be decomposed. And there are many ways of splitting those or classifying those carbon pools, and one of the common ones is to split it into active, slow, and resistant parts. Active, something that is decomposed in a matter of weeks to couple of years, slow, several decades, resistant, something that can stay in soil for hundreds to 1,000 years. And as you can see, about half of the soil organic matter in soil is that ancient 1,000-year-old carbon. Okay, so how can that carbon be protected? And so how can we reduce decomposition? Recent studies showed that essentially the microbes can decompose anything they can get their hands on. So the only truly effective way of protecting soil organic matter is by physical disconnection, physical barriers, making carbon inaccessible to microbes. You might wonder how could that be possible, since amount of microbes in a gram of soil is like 10 to double-digit numbers. In fact, microbes occupy just less than 1% of soil volume, and soil's internal structure is actually extremely complicated and extremely heterogeneous. What you see here is just a couple of examples of computer tomography scans of soil aggregates and at 15 micron resolution. And what you can see there is an extremely complicated, intricate network of pores, materials of different densities, organic pieces here and there. So it is a very complicated world, and it's easy to believe that some of those organic carbon pieces there could be protected from the microbial activity. So soil aggregation is the way to good soil aggregation is a way to increase that heterogeneity of soil structure and increase carbon protection. What you see here is a diagram from a study by Johan Six's group showing how carbon can be protected within the aggregates, and how tillage is something that breaks the aggregate, exposes organic material contained in it to the bacterial decomposition. So one of the management practices that we are looking at in this project, no-till management, is something that can possibly improve aggregation, increase soil heterogeneity of soil structure, and improve carbon protection. So this is just a brief summary of what I said, and here is a list of some useful sites and the references that were used in this study.